The snow fell heavily that night, burying the small mountain village in an eerie silence. The villagers had gathered in the square, their breath visible in the frigid air, forming clouds of fear and anticipation. At the center of the crowd stood a woman bound to a wooden post, her dark hair matted with snow and her eyes filled with defiance. "She is a witch," cried the village elder, his voice trembling with both conviction and fear. The crowd murmured in agreement, clutching their cloaks tighter as the temperature seemed to drop even further. The woman, known only as Elspeth, had been accused of summoning storms and cursing crops. Whether the accusations were true no longer mattered. The villagers were desperate for someone to blame. Elspeth laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that seemed to echo off the snow-covered mountains. "You think fire will cleanse your sins?" she spat, her voice carrying over the howling wind. "I curse you, your children, and your children's children. Every December, when the snow falls and the nights grow long, I will return. You will never know peace." The villagers recoiled in fear as the fire was lit. The flames roared to life, consuming Elspeth in seconds. Her screams mingled with the crackling of the fire, but her words, her curse, lingered in the air long after the fire died down. For years, nothing happened. The villagers thought they were safe, that the curse was nothing but the desperate ramblings of a dying woman. But as the years turned into decades, strange things began to occur every December. People vanished without a trace. Shadows moved where no light should reach, and the cold seemed to bite deeper than ever before. Centuries later, the village still lived in fear of December. Sophia gripped the steering wheel tightly as her car struggled up the winding, snow-covered road. The GPS on her phone blinked uncertainly, caught between the spotty signals of the remote mountains. She glanced at the time. It was already past 5 p.m., and the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a bluish twilight. "Almost there," she muttered to herself, though the sight of dense, skeletal trees lining the road made her doubt her own words. A journalist for Urban Tales magazine, Sophia had been assigned to cover the legends of this secluded village, Grey Hollow. Her editor had said it was the perfect story for their December issue: mysterious disappearances, an ancient curse, and a town that seemed frozen in time. It was supposed to be easy: stay a few nights, collect some interviews, snap a few photos, and head back to the city. But as the forest thickened and the road narrowed, Sophia couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in her chest. The first sign of the village was a weathered wooden archway, its faded letters barely visible under a coating of frost. "Welcome to Grey Hollow." The snow was falling harder now, large flakes sticking to her windshield. She slowed the car as the village came into view, a cluster of old timber-framed houses huddled together as if for warmth. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, and dim yellow lights glowed faintly through frost-covered windows. Sophia parked in front of the only building that looked remotely welcoming, the Grey Hollow Inn. Its sign creaked ominously in the wind, but the warm light spilling from its windows was enough to draw her inside. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a hunched back and a sharp gaze, greeted her with a curt nod. "You must be Miss Carver," she said, her voice as rough as the wooden beams of the inn. "Yes," Sophia replied, shaking off the snow from her coat. "Thank you for accommodating me on such short notice." The woman didn't respond, only motioned for Sophia to follow her. The interior of the inn was cozy but old, the kind of place that smelled of wood smoke and time-worn secrets. The walls were lined with faded photographs of the village, each one capturing a scene of snow and shadows. "Breakfast is at 7, the woman said as she handed Sophia a heavy brass key. "If you hear anything strange at night, ignore it." Sophia blinked. "Excuse me?" The innkeeper's eyes flickered, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she turned and shuffled away, leaving Sophia standing in the dimly lit hallway. Shaking off her unease, Sophia climbed the creaking stairs to her room. It was small but warm, with a single window that overlooked the snow-draped village square. After unpacking her bag, Sophia settled at the desk, pulling out her notebook and laptop. She had a long list of questions to ask the villagers, and she wanted to start early the next morning. But as she typed out her notes, her thoughts kept drifting back to the innkeeper's words: "If you hear anything strange at night, ignore it." Later, as the wind howled outside and the old building groaned under the weight of the snow, Sophia lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She told herself it was just her imagination when she thought she heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to the frail innkeeper. The clock on her bedside table ticked loudly in the silence, and for the first time since arriving, Sophia wondered if this story was worth the unease that had taken root deep in her chest. The morning came reluctantly, the sky a dull gray as the snow continued to fall in thick, relentless flakes. Sophia dressed quickly, eager to shake off the unease from the previous night. She convinced herself that the footsteps she'd heard were nothing more than the creaks and groans of an old building in the wind. Downstairs, the innkeeper was already busy, stirring a pot of porridge over the fire. She glanced at Sophia but said nothing as the journalist grabbed a plate of toast and coffee from the small dining table. "Do you know where I might find someone willing to talk about the village's history?" Sophia asked, breaking the silence. The innkeeper hesitated, her stirring slowing. "You'll want to see old Mr. Harris," she said finally. "He knows the stories. But don't go pestering people about things best left forgotten." "Why not?" Sophia pressed, sensing the woman's reluctance. The innkeeper fixed her with a sharp look. "Because December isn't a good time for digging up old ghosts." With that ominous statement, the woman turned back to her pot, leaving Sophia with more questions than answers. Determined not to let superstition deter her, Sophia bundled up and stepped out into the cold. The village was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The streets were empty except for the occasional figure hurrying by, their faces turned away from her gaze. Sophia noticed how the houses seemed to lean inward, as if trying to shield themselves from the encroaching forest. She found Mr. Harris in a small workshop near the edge of the village. The old man was hunched over a workbench, carving intricate patterns into a piece of wood. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You're not from around here," he said without looking up. "No," Sophia replied, stepping closer. "I'm a journalist. I'm here to write about the legends of Grey Hollow, particularly the December curse." At the mention of the curse, Mr. Harris's hand stilled. He set the carving tool down carefully and turned to face her. "You shouldn't be asking about that," he said, his voice low. "Some stories are better left untold." "Why?" "Because they're just stories," Sophia challenged, pulling out her notebook. "Or because they're real." The old man's lips pressed into a thin line. "If you're smart, you'll pack your things and leave before the snow traps you here. December in Grey Hollow isn't safe for outsiders." Sophia felt a chill creep down her spine, but she refused to let it show. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "If you won't help me, I'll find someone who will." Mr. Harris sighed, his shoulders sagging as if weighed down by years of unspoken fears. "Fine," he said at last. "You want to know about the curse? It started centuries ago with a woman named Elspeth." He spoke in halting sentences, his voice heavy with caution. "Elspeth had been accused of witchcraft and executed in the dead of winter," he explained. "Her curse had been the villagers' punishment, and every December since, strange things had happened. Disappearances, deaths, and shadows that moved where they shouldn't. Some say she walks the forest at night calling for vengeance," Mr. Harris said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Others say she's just waiting for the right time to finish what she started." "What does she want?" Sophia asked, her pen flying across the page. "Revenge," he said simply, "and she doesn't care who she takes it out on." Later that afternoon, Sophia wandered through the village square, her mind racing with everything Mr. Harris had told her. She snapped photos of the frost-covered buildings and the towering trees that seemed to watch her every move. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, as if the village itself was holding its breath. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Sophia decided to head back to the inn. The snow was falling harder now, and the streets were eerily empty. She was halfway there when she heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. She froze, her breath fogging the air as she strained to listen. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. It sounded like a name. Sophia. Her heart raced as she spun around, but the street behind her was empty. The only sound was the crunch of snow under her boots as she hurried back to the inn, her unease growing with every step. When she finally reached her room, she locked the door and leaned against it, her pulse hammering in her ears. She told herself it was just the wind, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Something, or someone, was watching her. The next morning brought no relief from the oppressive cold. Sophia awoke to frost creeping along the edges of her window, the glass so fogged over that it obscured the view of the village square. The events of the previous evening lingered in her mind. Whispers in the snow, the uneasy quiet of the streets, and the strange sense that she was being watched. Determined to push through her fear, she bundled up and set out to find more answers. Her first stop was the small library she'd noticed on her walk the day before. The building was nestled between two aging houses, its exterior weathered but welcoming. Inside, the library smelled of old paper and wood smoke. A single librarian sat behind the desk, a thin woman with silver hair tied back in a neat bun. She looked up as Sophia entered, her expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice soft but firm. "I'm looking for historical records," Sophia said, shaking the snow from her coat. "Anything about the village's founding or the curse." The librarian's face darkened at the mention of the curse, but she didn't protest. Instead, she stood and motioned for Sophia to follow. They walked to the back of the library, where rows of dusty books and yellowed manuscripts lined the shelves. "Most of our records from that time are incomplete," the librarian explained as she pulled a tattered journal from the shelf. "But this might be what you're looking for. It's the journal of a man named Thomas Greaves, one of the village's founders." Sophia took the journal carefully, her fingers brushing against its fragile pages. She found a table near the window and began to read. The entries were faded and difficult to decipher, but one passage stood out. December 17th, 1692. The witch Elspeth has been dealt with. The elders believe the curse to be a fabrication, the ramblings of a mad woman. But there are whispers in the woods, shadows that move without light, voices that call from the darkness. We are not safe. Not in December. A chill ran down Sophia's spine. She flipped through more pages, finding similar entries, accounts of strange occurrences, missing villagers, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to settle over the town every winter. "Find anything interesting?" The librarian's voice startled her, and she looked up to see the woman watching her closely. "This journal," Sophia said, holding it up. "It talks about the curse, about strange things happening in the woods." The librarian hesitated, then sat down across from her. "People here don't like to talk about it," she said quietly. "But the curse is real. Every December, someone goes missing. It's been that way for as long as anyone can remember." "Why hasn't anyone left?" Sophia asked. "Some have tried," the librarian said, "but Grey Hollow doesn't let go so easily." As Sophia left the library, her mind buzzed with questions. The journal had given her some insight into the village's history, but it also raised more mysteries. What exactly had happened to Elspeth, and why did the villagers stay, knowing the danger that came every December? She decided to explore the forest that bordered the village, hoping to find more clues. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she ventured into the woods, the trees towering above her like silent sentinels. The deeper she went, the quieter it became until the only sound was her own breathing. It was there, among the ancient trees, that she found it, a small clearing marked by a circle of blackened stones. The air felt heavier here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Sophia knelt to examine the stones, brushing away the snow to reveal strange symbols carved into their surface. A sudden snap of a branch made her spin around, her heart pounding. There was no one there, but the shadows between the trees seemed to shift as if something unseen was watching her. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. And then faintly, a whisper. "Sophia." She stumbled backward, nearly falling into the circle of stones. The whisper came again, closer this time, and she could swear she felt a cold breath against her neck. Panic surged through her, and she bolted back toward the village, the forest seeming to close in around her. When she finally emerged from the trees, gasping for air, she found herself in the square, the inn's warm lights beckoning her like a sanctuary. Inside her room, she locked the door and drew the curtains, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened, whatever was haunting Grey Hollow. It was no longer content to stay in the shadows. It had noticed her. Sophia awoke the next morning feeling as though she hadn't slept at all. Her dreams had been filled with fragmented images, shadows moving in the snow, whispers calling her name, and a woman's face, pale and haunting, staring at her from the trees. As she sat up in bed, the remnants of her dream clung to her, leaving her chest tight with unease. The innkeeper, as usual, offered no pleasantries when Sophia came downstairs. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she muttered, sliding a mug of coffee across the counter. "Maybe I have," Sophia said, trying to sound casual. "Do you know anything about a clearing in the forest, with black stones in a circle?" The innkeeper froze, her hands tightening around the edge of the counter. For a moment she said nothing, and Sophia thought she might refuse to answer. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice low. "You shouldn't have gone there." "Why not?" Sophia pressed. "What is that place?" The innkeeper leaned closer, her eyes dark and serious. "That's where they burned her, Elspeth." Sophia felt a chill creep down her spine. "You mean the witch?" "Witch or not, she cursed this village with her dying breath," the innkeeper said. "And that clearing is where her spirit lingers. You've stirred something you shouldn't have, girl." Determined to learn more, Sophia decided to visit another villager who might have answers. Mr. Harris had been reluctant, but there were others who seemed less wary of the curse. After some asking around, she was directed to Margaret, a woman in her 60s who had lived in Grey Hollow her entire life. Margaret's home was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of baked bread and herbal tea. She welcomed Sophia with a smile, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of caution. "So you're the journalist," she said, pouring tea into two mismatched mugs. "I've been expecting you." "You have?" Sophia asked, surprised. Margaret nodded, handing her a mug. "Word travels fast in a village this small, and you've been asking the kind of questions that tend to get people nervous." Sophia took a sip of tea, the warmth steadying her nerves. "I just want to understand what's happening here. The curse, the disappearances. There has to be more to it than just an old story." Margaret's smile faded, and she set her mug down with a soft clink. "There's always truth in old stories, my dear. The curse is real as the snow on the ground. Every December, someone vanishes. Some years, it's just one person. Other years, it's more." "But why?" Sophia asked, leaning forward. "What does she want?" "Revenge," Margaret said simply, "on the descendants of those who wronged her. But it's not just them she takes. Anyone who stirs the air around her name is fair game." Later that day, Sophia found herself drawn back to the forest. Despite Margaret's warnings, she felt an almost magnetic pull toward the clearing. This time she came prepared, bringing her camera and a notebook to document what she found. The forest was eerily silent as she approached the clearing. The circle of stones looked just as it had the day before, dark and ancient against the white snow. Sophia knelt beside one of the stones, snapping photos and sketching the strange symbols carved into its surface. As she worked, the air around her seemed to shift, growing colder. A soft sound reached her ears, so faint she thought she might have imagined it. A low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the trees. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, but the wail grew louder, more distinct. Sophia stood, her heart hammering in her chest, and scanned the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed to ripple, and for a brief moment she thought she saw a figure standing just beyond the clearing. A woman with long, dark hair and eyes that burned like embers. "Elspeth," Sophia whispered, barely able to speak. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the echo of the wail. Sophia stumbled backward, nearly dropping her camera, and bolted from the clearing. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and bending as if to block her path. When she finally emerged into the open air of the village, she was gasping for breath, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She had seen something, or someone, and there was no denying it now. The curse wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was watching her. Back at the inn, Sophia locked herself in her room and sank into the chair by the window, her hands still trembling from her encounter in the forest. She replayed the image of the figure in her mind, the dark hair, the burning eyes, the feeling of something ancient and angry watching her. She opened her notebook and began jotting down every detail she could remember, her pen scratching furiously against the paper. But the more she wrote, the more questions piled up in her mind. What did Elspeth want? Why had she revealed herself to Sophia? And most importantly, how could the curse be stopped? The next morning, Sophia decided to confront the villagers directly. If Elspeth's spirit was targeting people, someone in Grey Hollow must have more answers. She headed to the square where a few villagers were busy clearing snow from the paths, their faces turned away as she approached, but Sophia wasn't deterred. "Excuse me," she said, stopping a man who was piling snow into a cart. "I need to know about Elspeth, the curse. Why is everyone so afraid to talk about it?" The man froze, his face pale. "You don't know what you're messing with," he muttered, refusing to meet her eyes. "Just leave while you still can." "I can't," Sophia said firmly. "I've seen her, in the forest." That got his attention. He dropped his shovel and grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You've seen her?" he hissed. "Then it's too late for you. She doesn't let people go." Before Sophia could press further, the man hurried away, leaving her alone in the square. Frustrated, she turned to a group of women standing near the church, but as soon as she approached, they dispersed, whispering nervously among themselves. Her only option was to return to Margaret's house. The older woman had been more willing to talk than anyone else, and Sophia hoped she might have more answers. When Margaret opened the door, her expression was grave, as though she had been expecting Sophia. "You've seen her, haven't you?" Margaret asked, stepping aside to let her in. Sophia nodded, sinking into a chair at the kitchen table. "In the forest. She was just standing there watching me." Margaret sighed, placing a steaming cup of tea in front of her. "Then she's marked you." "Marked me?" Sophia repeated, her voice rising. "What does that mean?" "It means she's chosen you as her next target," Margaret said, her tone grim. "She doesn't just take people at random. She chooses. And once she's chosen, there's no escaping her." "There has to be a way," Sophia said desperately. "Someone must have tried to stop her." Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There's a story," she said, "about a ritual. It's dangerous and nearly impossible, but it's the only thing anyone has ever tried to break the curse." Margaret explained that the ritual required a combination of ancient symbols, specific items tied to Elspeth's life, and a sacrifice. The instructions had been passed down through generations, hidden in fragments among the village's elders, but no one had attempted it in decades, not since the last group had failed, losing their lives in the process. "What kind of sacrifice?" Sophia asked, her stomach twisting. Margaret looked away, her hands trembling as she gripped her tea. "It has to be something that binds Elspeth to this world. Her pain, her hatred, her vengeance." Sophia sat back, her mind reeling. She wasn't sure she believed in rituals or sacrifices, but after what she'd seen in the forest, she couldn't dismiss the possibility. If there was even a chance of stopping Elspeth, she had to try. That night, Sophia returned to her room and began piecing together everything she'd learned. She sketched the symbols from the stones in the clearing, cross-referencing them with the notes she'd taken from the library. She listed the items Margaret had mentioned: a locket, a piece of fabric, and an iron dagger, all said to have belonged to Elspeth. As the hours dragged on, the wind outside picked up, howling like a living thing. Sophia lit the small oil lamp on her desk, its warm glow casting long shadows on the walls. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't notice the cold seeping into the room until she saw her breath fogging the air. She looked up, her pulse quickening. The window was shut, but frost had crept across the glass in intricate, twisting patterns. The lamp flickered, its flame shrinking until it was barely a pinprick of light. And then she heard it. A soft, mournful whisper, so close it could have been inside the room. Sophia. She spun around, her eyes darting to the corners of the room. The whisper came again, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway, forcing herself to move. Sophia crept to the door and pressed her ear against it. The footsteps stopped, but she could feel a presence on the other side, heavy, oppressive, and unrelenting. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, only silence. The silence pressed against Sophia like a living thing, thick and suffocating. She held her breath, her ear still pressed to the door, straining to hear any sound. The footsteps had stopped, but she could feel it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Summoning all her courage, she turned the lock and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The flickering oil lamp at the far end cast distorted shadows on the walls, but there was no sign of anyone or anything nearby. Sophia stepped into the corridor, her heart pounding, and peered down the staircase. A faint creak echoed through the inn, followed by the soft rustle of fabric, as if someone had just turned a corner. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Gripping her notebook tightly as an improvised weapon, she descended the stairs slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears. As she reached the bottom, a gust of cold air swept through the inn, extinguishing the lamps and plunging the space into darkness. In the pitch-black room, Sophia fumbled for her phone, its faint glow offering a small comfort. Her hands shook as she activated the flashlight, its narrow beam illuminating the inn's main floor. The chairs and tables were exactly as she'd left them earlier that evening, but the front door stood slightly ajar, snow blowing in through the gap. She crept toward the door, every nerve in her body screaming for her to turn back. As she pushed it open, the icy wind bit at her face, and she found herself staring out into the empty village square. The snow fell in heavy sheets, muffling the world, but even in the oppressive quiet she felt it, the presence that had been following her. And then she saw it. Standing at the edge of the square, just beyond the reach of her flashlight, was the figure from the forest. The woman's long dark hair clung to her pale face, her burning eyes locked onto Sophia. Despite the snow swirling around her, her body remained unnaturally still, as though she were a part of the landscape itself. "What do you want?" Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The figure didn't move, but a whisper carried through the air nonetheless, threading itself into Sophia's mind. You called me." Sophia stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she tried to process what she'd seen. Elspeth wasn't just a story, she was real, and she wasn't bound to the forest. The rest of the night passed in fits of restless sleep, broken by the creaks and groans of the old inn. Every time Sophia closed her eyes, she saw those burning, vengeful eyes staring back at her. When morning finally came, she felt more exhausted than she had the night before. Over breakfast, Sophia decided to tell the innkeeper what had happened. Despite the woman's earlier warnings, Sophia needed answers, and fast. The innkeeper listened in silence, her face unreadable, before finally setting down her teacup with a sigh. "She's chosen you," the woman said flatly. "There's no running from her now." "But why?" Sophia demanded. "I haven't done anything to her. I'm just here to tell the story." "You've stirred her spirit," the innkeeper said. "Asking questions, poking around the forest. It's enough. Elspeth isn't just haunting this village. She's searching for something or someone." "What does she want from me?" Sophia asked, her voice rising. The innkeeper hesitated, her gaze fixed on the table. "Only she knows. But if you want to survive, you'll need to finish what others before you couldn't. The ritual." Later that day, Sophia met Margaret again, determined to piece together the fragments of the ritual. Margaret gave her a worn leather book, its pages filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. This belonged to my grandmother, Margaret explained. She tried to stop Elspeth once, but she didn't make it. The book detailed the items needed for the ritual and the steps to perform it. Sophia would need to gather Elspeth's belongings, the locket, the fabric, and the dagger, and place them in the clearing where she had been burned. Once there, she would have to chant a series of incantations, calling upon the same forces Elspeth had used to bind her curse. But there's a catch, Margaret said grimly. To break the curse, you have to offer something in return. A life for a life. Sophia's stomach churned. A life? You mean someone has to die? Margaret nodded. Elspeth's vengeance is tied to her death. To unbind her spirit, you have to replace her pain with another's. As Sophia left Margaret's house, the weight of the task ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders. The ritual was dangerous, perhaps even impossible, but it was the only way to end the curse and to save herself. That night, as the snow fell heavier than ever, she began preparing for what was to come. The locket, she learned, was rumored to be hidden in the church. The fabric, a piece of Elspeth's dress, was said to be buried with the remains of her mother, who had died years before the execution. And the dagger, the tool of her vengeance, was thought to be lost in the forest. Sophia didn't know how she would find them all, but she knew one thing for certain. Time was running out. Sophia spent the next morning strategizing her search for the 3 artifacts needed for the ritual. With each passing day, December seemed to tighten its icy grip on the village, the snow falling heavier, the air colder, and the silence more oppressive. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing on her, an invisible force urging her to hurry. Her first destination was the church. The church stood at the far edge of the village, its steeple barely visible through the thick snowfall. Inside, the air was cold and still, the faint scent of wax and incense lingering in the shadows. Sophia approached the altar, where a priest, an older man with deep-set eyes, was arranging candles. "Father, I need your help," she said, her voice echoing faintly in the empty space. The priest turned, his expression wary. "You're the journalist," he said. "I've heard about you." "Then you know what I'm looking for," Sophia replied. "Elspeth's locket. Do you know where it is?" The priest's face darkened and he crossed his arms over his chest. That locket should have been destroyed long ago. It's cursed, like everything she left behind. "I don't want to keep it," Sophia said quickly. "I need it to stop her." The priest hesitated, then sighed deeply. "It's hidden in the crypt beneath the church," he said. "But be warned, the locket carries her essence. Touching it might draw her closer." He handed her a rusted key and led her to a trapdoor behind the altar. "Be careful," he said, his voice heavy with warning, "and may God protect you." The crypt was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. Sophia descended the stone steps cautiously, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The narrow passage led to a small chamber, where a simple wooden box sat on a pedestal, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Her hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside lay the locket, a delicate silver pendant, tarnished with age but still eerily beautiful. As her fingers brushed the metal, a sudden chill ran through her, and the air seemed to grow heavier. A whisper echoed in the chamber, soft but unmistakable. "You cannot save them." Sophia snatched the locket and bolted up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind her. The priest was waiting, his face pale. "Did you hear her?" he asked quietly. Sophia nodded. "She knows." Her next stop was the graveyard, where Elspeth's mother was buried. Margaret had told her that the dress fragment was interred with the older woman's remains, but the thought of disturbing a grave sent shivers down Sophia's spine. Armed with a small shovel and a lantern, she entered the snow-covered graveyard at dusk. The graves were marked with weathered stones, their inscriptions barely legible. It took her nearly an hour to find the right one, the name barely visible through the frost, Marianne Blackwood. Sophia hesitated, her breath visible in the cold air. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she forced herself to start digging. The frozen earth was hard and unyielding, each movement of the shovel sending jolts of pain through her arms. Finally, the edge of a wooden coffin emerged from the soil. She pried it open with trembling hands, revealing a bundle of faded fabric resting atop the bones. It was a piece of a dress, its once vivid colors now muted and gray. As she reached for it, the ground beneath her seemed to shift, and a low growl echoed through the graveyard. She spun around, her lantern casting wild shadows, but there was nothing there. Grabbing the fabric, she scrambled out of the grave and ran back to the village, her heart racing. The final item, the dagger, proved the most elusive. Margaret had warned her that it was lost in the forest, likely near the clearing where Elspeth had been executed. With no other leads, Sophia ventured back into the woods the following morning, the snow crunching under her boots as she retraced her steps. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound her own breathing. The clearing appeared ahead, the circle of blackened stones stark against the snow. Sophia began searching the area, brushing away snow and debris in the hope of finding the dagger. After nearly an hour, her flashlight caught a glint of metal buried beneath a tree root. She dug frantically, her fingers numb from the cold, until she uncovered the dagger. Its blade was blackened, its hilt ornate, carved with symbols that matched those on the stones. As soon as she touched it, a piercing scream shattered the silence, echoing through the forest. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and shadows began to shift and writhe around her. "No," Sophia whispered, clutching the dagger tightly. "You're not stopping me." She turned and ran, the shadows following her, twisting and reaching as if to drag her back. When she finally burst out of the forest and into the village, the shadows dissipated, leaving her gasping for air. That evening, Sophia sat in her room, the three artifacts spread out on the table before her. The locket, the fabric, and the dagger seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, their presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. She had everything she needed for the ritual, but the hardest part was still ahead. She couldn't shake Margaret's words. A life for a life. Who would pay the price to end the curse? Sophia stared at the artifacts laid out before her, the weight of their significance pressing down on her. The locket shimmered faintly under the lamplight, the fabric seemed to pulse with a faint energy, and the dagger radiated a coldness that felt alive. Together, they were the key to ending the curse, but only if she could make the ultimate choice. The innkeeper's words echoed in her mind, a life for a life. The thought made her stomach churn, but she pushed it aside. There had to be another way, a way to break the curse without bloodshed. She just needed to figure it out before Elspeth came for her. The next morning, Sophia returned to Margaret's house, clutching the book of rituals tightly. The older woman opened the door with a grim expression, her gaze falling immediately to the bundle in Sophia's arms. "You found them," Margaret said, her voice heavy. "Then you know what comes next." "I can't do it," Sophia said, stepping inside. "There has to be another way. Isn't there something else she wants? Something that will satisfy her without killing someone?" Margaret shook her head, her face etched with sorrow. "Elspeth's pain runs deep. Her hatred is what binds her to this world. The sacrifice isn't just for her. It's to sever the power that keeps her alive." "But why a life?" Sophia demanded. "There has to be another way to break that bond." Margaret hesitated, then motioned for Sophia to sit. "There's one other way," she said quietly. "But it's riskier. You'd have to confront her directly, inside the clearing, and offer her something she values more than vengeance." "What does that mean?" Sophia asked, her pulse quickening. "You have to make her see humanity again," Margaret said. "Remind her of who she was before the pain consumed her. But if you fail, she'll take you, and the curse will remain." Sophia's heart pounded as she absorbed Margaret's words. Confronting Elspeth directly sounded impossible, but it was better than the alternative. If there was even a chance of breaking the curse without taking a life, she had to try. That night, Sophia prepared for the confrontation. She packed the artifacts carefully, along with a lantern, her notebook, and the ritual book. The wind howled outside, carrying with it an unnatural chill that seeped into her bones. She knew the risk she was taking, but she also knew she couldn't live with herself if she sacrificed someone else. As midnight approached, she left the inn and made her way to the forest. The snow fell thick and heavy, muffling her footsteps as she ventured deeper into the trees. The clearing loomed ahead, its circle of blackened stones glowing faintly in the darkness. Sophia stepped into the circle and set the artifacts in the center. As she arranged them according to the ritual's instructions, the air around her grew colder, and a low hum filled the clearing. She lit the lantern and took a deep breath, her heart racing as she began to speak the incantation. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Sophia's voice echoed through the clearing. The symbols on the stones began to glow, and a shadowy figure emerged from the trees. Elspeth. Her form was more distinct now, her pale face illuminated by an otherworldly light. Her burning eyes locked onto Sophia, and the air grew thick with malice. "You've come to end me," Elspeth said, her voice a mixture of anger and sorrow. "But you don't understand what you're asking." "I'm not here to destroy you," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I'm here to free you." Elspeth's expression flickered, a brief flash of surprise crossing her face. "Free me?" she repeated, her tone skeptical. "Why would you care about freeing me?" "Because this curse isn't just hurting the villagers," Sophia said. "It's hurting you. You've been trapped here, consumed by hatred for centuries. Don't you want peace?" Elspeth's form wavered, her burning eyes dimming slightly. "Peace," she whispered, as though the word were foreign to her. "They took everything from me. My life, my family, my name. How can there be peace after that?" "I don't know," Sophia admitted, stepping closer. "But holding on to this anger hasn't brought you what you want, has it? It's only kept you here, alone." Elspeth's gaze softened, and for a moment, Sophia thought she might have reached her. But then the burning eyes flared to life again, and Elspeth's voice rose in a wail that shook the trees. "You think you can undo centuries of pain with words? You know nothing of what I've suffered." Sophia stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists. "Then show me," she said. "Show me what happened to you." The forest around her shifted, and suddenly Sophia was no longer in the clearing. She was standing in the village square centuries earlier, watching as Elspeth was dragged to the pyre. The villagers' faces were twisted with fear and hatred, their shouts blending into a deafening roar. Sophia felt Elspeth's terror and anger as though it were her own, the betrayal of those she had trusted, the agony of the fire consuming her, the desperate need for justice. It was overwhelming, suffocating, but Sophia forced herself to endure it. When the vision ended, Sophia found herself back in the clearing, tears streaming down her face. Elspeth stood before her, her form flickering like a dying flame. "I'm sorry," Sophia said, her voice breaking. "You didn't deserve what happened to you, but you don't have to carry this alone anymore." Elspeth's burning eyes dimmed, and the air around them grew still. For the first time, her expression was not one of anger, but of sadness. "I just wanted them to see," she whispered, "to feel what I felt." "They can't undo the past," Sophia said gently, "but you can choose to let go, to find peace." Elspeth stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. The glow around her faded, and her form dissolved into the night, leaving only silence. Sophia sank to her knees, the weight of the confrontation finally crashing down on her. The clearing was quiet now, the oppressive energy gone. She had done it. The curse was broken. As she gathered the artifacts and made her way back to the village, she couldn't shake the feeling that Elspeth was watching over her, not as an enemy, but as a lingering presence finally at rest. Weeks had passed since Sophia left Grey Hollow. She returned to the city with her notes, photos, and the story of her encounter with the curse, a tale too unbelievable for her editor, but one she knew was real. As she wrote her article, she found herself omitting the more supernatural elements. Instead, she focused on the resilience of the villagers and the weight of their history. But something about the experience lingered. In her small apartment, Sophia tried to return to her routine, but sleep rarely came easily. Every night she dreamed of the clearing, the blackened stones, and Elspeth's burning eyes sometimes. She woke to the sound of whispers, faint and fleeting, as if the wind itself carried her name. One night, unable to sleep, Sophia decided to revisit her photos from Grey Hollow. She scrolled through images of the snow-covered village, the church, the forest, and then she froze. One photo taken in the clearing showed the circle of stones with the dagger placed at its center, but in the background, barely visible through the haze of snow, was a figure. Long, dark hair, pale face, burning eyes. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen anyone there when she took the photo, but the figure was unmistakable. It was Elspeth. Determined to understand what was happening, Sophia returned to the journal she had taken from the library in Grey Hollow. Flipping through its fragile pages, she discovered an entry she hadn't noticed before. It was dated several years after Elspeth's execution. The curse was not merely vengeance, it was a bond. Those who confront her will carry her mark, perhaps forever. The words sent a chill down her spine. Was she still connected to Elspeth, even after breaking the curse? Or had the bond between them been something more than she'd realized? As the weeks turned into months, Sophia began to notice other strange occurrences. Shadows moved in the corners of her apartment, just beyond her line of sight. Her belongings were often misplaced, though she was certain she hadn't touched them. And the whispers grew louder, sometimes so clear they seemed to come from just behind her. At first, she told herself it was stress, a lingering trauma from her time in Grey Hollow. But deep down, she knew the truth. Elspeth wasn't gone. The bond they had formed in the clearing, through pain and understanding, had tethered them together. One snowy December night, Sophia stood by her window, staring out at the city. The streets were quiet, the world blanketed in white. As she watched the snow fall, she felt a presence behind her, a familiar, almost comforting weight. "Elspeth," she whispered, turning slowly. There was no one there, but the air was thick with the feeling of being watched. A faint whisper brushed against her ear, soft and mournful. "Thank you." Sophia exhaled, her breath fogging the cold glass. Perhaps Elspeth wasn't haunting her. Perhaps she was simply there. A shadow of the past lingering in the present, not as a curse, but as a reminder. Sophia didn't know if the whispers would ever fade, but for the first time since leaving Grey Hollow, she felt a strange sense of peace. Elspeth had been freed from her hatred, and in some way, Sophia had become her connection to the world she had lost.